family or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, in the Bible, in Titus 2, it talks about how older women are to mentor, disciple younger women, and that certainly happens within the church. And certainly for millennia, various mothers have been able to give advice to their daughters, and we're going to, in a sense, have a chance to listen into some of that today as we talk about this new book, Letters to My Daughters, The Art of Being a Wife, and it is written by Barbara Rainey. Now, Barbara and Dennis Rainey have been through it all. They've seen the triumphs and the tragedies, the mistakes, and enduring love and joy. They are the founders of FamilyLife and have spoken at Weekends to Remember conferences around the world. And by the way, if you've never been to a Weekend to Remember, you need to run and find out how you can register for one in your community. Of course, we have a link to all the material that is available at FamilyLifeToday.com. They have written all sorts of books, a couple of that perhaps you are familiar with, are Moments Together for Intimacy, Moments Together for Couples. And so we welcome to the phone call today, Barbara Rainey. Thank you for joining us.
Well, hi, Kerby. I'm glad to be here.
I might just say that this is just a beautiful book. Of course, anybody that knows you knows your love of art and your artistic background and your love of gardening and everything. I was telling my wife that it reminds me of maybe a Edith Schaefer kind of book or something like this. I want people to understand this is more than just a 200-page book. This is a book that has paintings, it has poems, it has pictures, it has stories. And so I think a lot of people that maybe are wondering what to get their mother on Mother's Day or what to get their daughters for a birthday, this would be a very good book. So congratulations on doing such a great job.
Thank you for that compliment. To be compared to Edith Schaefer is quite an honor. So,
well,
thank you.
And again, anybody that knows you and Dennis know that certainly you came to the marriage with some differences. You're kind of like me, a kind of a type A person, very organized, linear. But on the other hand, you also bring a lot of, if I might say, right hemisphere creativity with your artistic background and things of that nature. Dennis, if you know him at all, and most of us have gotten to know him over the years on radio, he loves to hunt, he loves to fish, he's an outdoors guy, and kind of a global thinker. So right off the bat, you had a challenge to begin to figure out how to put those two different kinds of people together in a marriage.
We really did. And, you know, we're not that different than anybody else because most of us marry opposites. The old adage, opposites attract, is true. And we were opposites, but we didn't realize how different we were until after we were married, which is often the case with most couples then and now. It's not really any different. And so the challenge right off the bat for most marriages is how are we going to handle these differences that we thought were so cute and attractive in the beginning, and now maybe they're not so cute anymore. And how do we make this work when we're two such very different people?
Well, I would think so. And, of course, we've always said opposites attract and then they attack. And so that's another part of that you need to really begin to sort through. But, again, as we get into this book, we're going to look at marriage, for example, as a masterpiece. And then you have a number of kind of, I guess it would be 7 similes. Marriage is like a fine cuisine. Marriage is like grand architecture. Marriage is like elegant music. Marriage is like a beautiful dancing. Marriage is like a secret garden. Marriage is like masterful photography. Marriage is like watercolor painting. In each one of those, you use this to illustrate some very important principles that you have over the years been able to pass on to your daughters or daughter-in-laws, and in a sense are giving us a chance to kind of listen in to some of the advice that you've given to them.
Yeah. I've really written this book for their generation. It's not for my generation. It's for my daughters and their friends and all of the young women that are in their 20s and 30s, because I think one of the results, one of the many, many negative results of the culture of divorce that we've been a part of for so many decades is that marriage has lost its luster. And not only that, marriage is viewed oftentimes as an obstacle. It's not viewed as lofty. It's not viewed as beautiful. And so I wanted to illustrate using these different art forms, from cooking to painting to music to dancing, etc. I wanted to use these different art forms to help lift our eyes to, as women, to see that God's intentions, God's purposes, God's plan for marriage was beautiful and glorious and wonderful. And just because there are a lot of marriages that don't work, just because there are a lot of marriages that we see that fail or that struggle, doesn't mean that the original design was not magnificent. And so I think by looking at marriage from a different angle, I'm hoping to help these young women who are afraid, who are worried, who a lot of young men and women are not even married when they hit their 30s because they're just afraid of it.
Yes, they are.
And I want to help them see that it's a glorious institution that God created, and it's a great privilege to be married. Yes, it takes a lot of work, but the work is worth it. And I want to challenge them and lift their eyes, and hopefully they will see that it is worth fighting for. It's worth working for because the results are so beneficial.
Well, and to use some of the illustrations that you use, I know that every once in a while you get to drag Dennis to an art gallery, and if you walk through a gallery, you'll see some very beautiful paintings, but you'll see some that are kind of dark and foreboding, or if you want to change the metaphor to music. If you were to walk in the midst of an opera, and I was in an opera house just a week ago, and you were to walk in during one scene, you go, well, I don't like opera because, oh man, all these discordant things, people getting shot or killed or everything. And so sometimes you have to recognize that marriage isn't always just beautiful, and Hollywood has painted us a false image, or as your husband likes to use, he's given us the false box top to try to put the jigsaw puzzles together. And marriage, as you said, is worth fighting for, and sometimes it's really going through what I call the valley of the diapers and some of those teen years when things aren't really very easy, are they?
Yeah, and I think we've lost that long view of marriage, and I think because our culture, our society, we're all so used to things being instant with our phones and our computers and our TVs and everything. We can get access to anything in a second or two, and when we can't get something in 5 seconds, we're frustrated. And so I think that bleeds over into our relationships, and we expect relationships to improve or change or get better on a dime. And we've lost that long-term, lifetime perspective that marriage is a marathon. It's a lifetime relationship, and we all go through difficult times. Every single marriage ever on the planet has gone through seasons of trial and seasons of difficulty, but they're seasons, and we lose sight of the fact that a season is not the end of the story. And so, again, I'm hopeful that what I've written will help young women in particular, but even women in the empty nest season where I am, to realize that there is hope for tomorrow, that spring will come again if you're in the winter, a winter season in your marriage. That doesn't mean that's going to define you for the rest of your life. There's always hope as long as we are alive and as long as we're willing to invite the Creator to come in and do what He does best, which is redeem and restore and make all things new. So that's my hope, is that I can challenge and encourage women to think with the long-term view in mind for their marriages.
Again, seeing your marriage as a work of art. And even this week we had Greg Laurie in here, and he was asking how many years had been married, and we're almost up to 42. It's 41, and he's just 42. Of course, you are in that same range. And again, he was saying how often it is that when somebody says they've been married, say 40 years, you almost get a standing ovation because of some of the things you've talked about. And we recognize that when you get to our 50 years, if we all make it there, that'll be something significant as well. And it's really a great opportunity to learn from individuals that have walked the path. So we're going to take a break, come back and talk about some of these examples. Marriage is like a fine cuisine. We'll talk about that with Barbara Rainey right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America's in the midst of a heroin epidemic. Last month, the National Governors Association accepted a proposal to establish guidelines on prescribing the painkillers that are abused and often lead to heroin abuse. If that sounds like a backward way to deal with heroin addiction, consider these facts. According to the New York Times, 75% of heroin addicts use these prescription painkillers before turning to heroin. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control reports that 45% of people who used heroin were also addicted to prescription painkillers. So why did this happen? Well, in previous decades, prescription painkillers became cheap and plentiful.
When authorities began to crack down on unscrupulous doctors who were overprescribing pain meds, addicts began searching for alternatives. Many chose heroin. The heroin epidemic is upon us because of demand and supply. The demand was fueled by many already addicted to painkillers looking for another high. But we should also look at supply. Ann Coulter, in a recent column, reminds us that it is harder to stay away from drugs when Mexico is flooding the country with them. The amount of heroin seized at the border increased sixfold from 2007 to 2013, and heroin use doubled during that same period. Not only are illegal immigrants coming across the border, so are illegal drugs. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman has been in the news because of his prison escape. But he also bragged that he supplied more heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana than anybody else in the world. And I might also add that these drug lords are also bringing in lots of prescription painkillers. We need not only crack down on prescription drug abuse, but we also need to close our border to illegal drug trafficking. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Barbara Rainey as we talk about her new book, Letters to My Daughters, The Art of Being a Wife. It is published by Bethany House. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a way for you to order it. And, of course, also a link to FamilyLifeToday.com. So lots of great places to find some of those resources. 200 pages. It's the kind of book you're going to want to give to your daughters, your daughter-in-law. That's actually what Suzanne and I are planning on doing. And I think you will enjoy it. And just full of not only lots of good biblical common sense advice, but paintings and pictures and poems and so much more. And Barbara, let me, if we can, maybe work our way through some of these similes. Marriage is like a fine cuisine. You talk a little bit about having your grandchildren. I might mention you have 6 children and 19 grandchildren. At least that's the count I have at the moment, unless another one's been born. But you talk
there
about
are a few more, but that's okay.
Yeah, so we got to change that on the material I got, because I'm sure it's just adding up all the time.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, it's great. But okay, what about cooking with different cookbooks? You talked about cooking with your grandchildren, and of course they're really not really cooking, but it brings us back to the point we made just a minute ago. There are remarkable differences between you and Dennis, and as you begin to talk with Ashley and all of your children, you're really trying to help them understand that if the two of you are identical, one of you is unnecessary. So those differences are where you can begin to develop a marriage and a family in a way that honors God. Explain that, if you might.
Well, one of the things that we struggle with as husbands and wives in marriage is the fact that we are so very different. We love that about each other when we're dating and when we're newlyweds, but not long into the marriage, some of those differences begin to feel a little bit like sandpaper. And if you focus on those differences, you're going to they're just going to grow larger and larger. I remember early in our marriage, and I don't think we had been married less than 6 months, but I don't even think it was 6 months. And I started noticing some of these things that I was oblivious to when we were dating and engaged. And I started seeing them, and I thought, oh, my, what should I do about this? And I knew changing my husband was not right. I knew that I couldn't change it, but I thought, aha, maybe what I'm supposed to do is pray and ask God to change him. And so I made this list of about 5 to 10 things that I felt like needed to be changed. And it was subtle. I mean, they weren't crisis things, but I thought, maybe his mom just didn't teach him how to pick up his clothes, or maybe he needs my help to learn to be more organized. And so I began to pray about all these things that I felt like needed to be fixed or changed. And I learned a really valuable lesson. God just began to show me that by focusing every day on this list of things that I thought were wrong or that needed to be fixed or that were not up to my standards or whatever, I realized that the more I prayed about them, the more I thought about them, and the more I thought about them, the bigger they became, and they began to loom in our relationship, and all I saw was what was wrong with him. And I realized that was not fun. It was taking the joy out of our relationship, and so I literally tore the piece of paper up and threw it away, and I said to God, okay, this is your business. This is the way you've made him. If you want to change him, it's up to you, and if you don't change him, that's fine too, because you know what you're doing, and I want you to give me the grace that I need to live with these things. This is who he is. And I have to say that over the years of our marriage, those qualities that I could have changed if I had had the power are the very things that just make our relationship so much fun. Dennis is spontaneous, and I'm a planner. I want to be organized. I want to know what's going to be happening next. But he's a planner. I mean, he's spontaneous, and so we'll do these fun, real, off-the-cuff things that I would never go and do on my own. And so together, we're a really good balance with the strengths and weaknesses that we both bring to the relationship. So I learned, and I encourage young women to don't focus on the things that are wrong. Focus on the things that are right, and trust that God in his timing will change anything that he feels like needs to be changed. But some of the things I was wanting to change in my husband's life were a part of his DNA, and God wasn't going to ever change that because that's the way he made him. So it's learning to accept what God has done, the way God has built this man, and trust that God knows what he's doing, and say, okay, thank you, God, this is the gift. He is the gift you've given me, and help me to accept him with grace and to love him the way he is, and to enjoy all of these different qualities that he brings to our relationship.
Sure. And you talk about hiking in Colorado, and he's saying, well, let's hike to the top of that ridge. And you're already at 10,000 feet, and you're thinking, I don't want to go any further, but you do. And the whole conversation is about, well, I'm always kind of stretching you, and I'm always going along reluctantly. But not only has it helped your marriage, I think it's fair to say that family life today would not be where it is today if it weren't for that kind of global thinking, that adventurous spirit of your husband. Oh, my
gosh, no question. No question. Because he has pushed me to try things and to do things that I would have never done, and I'm so glad I did. And likewise, because of my interests, I write in the book that he's gone to many a museum with me, and he appreciates things that he would have never had the sense of appreciation for were it not for what I bring to his life and his world. So, yeah, Family Life today would have never gotten off the ground because I would have planned it to death. So we're a very good balance, and
balance.
Marriages are like that, and God knows what he's doing, and we just are too quick to question him and to think that he doesn't know what he's doing, and this had to be a mistake. And it's not a mistake.
One of the other chapters is marriage is like a grand architecture, or an architect. And in some respects, it gets into blueprints. And of course, you can't go to a Family Life conference without hearing Dennis talk about blueprints. But you're talking about more than that. And it's back to this whole idea of a blueprint for a chapel, and the idea of what it takes, and windows instead of walls. Talk about that, because that's another important principle to pass on to young women.
Yeah, I think that when we think about our marriage as a structure, we think about our marriage, if we can do that, to think about it as a chapel that God is constructing, because each of us who are believers in Jesus Christ, we each contain the Holy Spirit. We house the Holy Spirit. The Bible tells us we are his temple. And so together, Dennis and I are containers for the Spirit of God. And together, we're building a relationship that is supposed to reflect him and show him off to the world. And so as we work through our differences, as we work through difficulties, as we push through that to solutions and to greater understanding, we're building lots of windows, lots of doorways, lots of beauty through which the Spirit of God can shine to the world. But if we decide this is too hard, I don't want to fight through this discussion again. I mean, we have topics in our marriage that we've talked about over and over again for decades. And I don't know that we're going to ever completely solve some of these things. But we continue to push through to greater understanding and greater acceptance and greater freedom with one another. But if we ever said, no, I'm not going to talk about that anymore, no, I don't want to fix that, no, I don't want to go there anymore, that's building a wall. That's putting up a barrier between us, and that's saying this is off limits. And so therefore the Spirit can't shine through that place because you've put up a barrier. And so the whole idea of marriage being a chapel or a church or a cathedral or a house of a place that contains the Spirit of God is just a different way to look at it. And it helps me understand that my being teachable, keeping my heart right before God, keeping our relationship open and growing and true and right is what God wants us to do, because He wants the world to see who He is through the relationship of the husband and wife, which is a picture of Christ in the church.
Sure. And Dennis talks about sometimes we have on our marriages these do not trespass signs up there that keeps us from talking about those issues. But I love, even as you ended one of your letters, you said, remember this, your husband is not your enemy, nor is he the problem. Be honest about your selfishness with each other. It's worth a risk. Confess your sin every time and grant forgiveness freely. He keeps the windows clean and clear. You are only responsible for you. Let God do the work in your husband's heart. He's the expert, not you. Some really good advice, and just full of the kind of advice we see in this book. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about marriage is like an elegant music, as well as marriage is like beautiful dancing. That gets us into, okay, following an individual's lead. What about submission? Some very sometimes controversial issues, but I think, again, Barbara Rainey has done a very good job of helping us understand this. So let me, just as we go to a break, recognize that, first of all, if you would be interested in the book, you probably can find it in your local bookstore, but as always, we have a link for you to find it, and it will be real easy to find. Just click on the picture of the book. We also have a link to Family Life Today. Let me give all of you an assignment to go to that website. If you've never been to a Weekend to Remember, let me encourage you to find out if there might be one in an area close to you, because it really will make a significant difference in your marriage. And for those of you that are parents and grandparents, perhaps you could scholarship someone to go there. Sometimes I know at the back of the room there's some heel marks as we go in, and people don't want to be there, but after they're there about 5 or 10 minutes, they realize, no, I really needed to be here. So again, this is another way that you can connect up with Family Life Today. And of course, let me recommend this book, Letters to My Daughters, The Art of Being a Wife. And it is written by Barbara Rainey, and you can find it in your local bookstore, no doubt. It is published by Bethany House. And we'll take a break and come back with more right after these messages.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net, or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us Barbara Rainey, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. This may be one of those where you just want to sit back and listen, take some notes, but if you'd like to join us, we might be able to slip in a phone call or two before the end of the hour, talking about her book, Letters to My Daughters, The Art of Being a Wife. Thought we would focus on two issues. Marriage is like elegant music. Marriage is like beautiful dancing. And Barbara, that gets us into what has sometimes become more controversial, and it surfaced even in the letter that you received from one of your daughters, talking about the fact that, it's okay for you to follow Dennis's lead, and he's kind of a leader anyway, but isn't this just a tad old-fashioned, and aren't we, working as hard as these men? And I love the fact that you said, well, okay, while we're talking about music, let's go back to the original score, which we find in Genesis. So help us out, because that's a question a lot of young people, a lot of young women are asking today.
Yeah, I think we forget that marriage was designed by God. It was His idea. He's the one that gave the instructions or directions. So the things that sometimes we struggle with, that we are uncomfortable with, they're not man's ideas. They're not a woman's idea. They're God's idea. And so it really helps to go back and look at what God said in the very beginning and to look at it from His perspective. What was He trying to say with marriage? What was He trying to communicate to a watching world? And much of what He's trying to communicate is a relationship that reflects who God is. God is plural. God is a Trinity, and there is a relationship between God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And marriage, somehow, some mysterious way, is supposed to help us understand that relationship. And so God has made it clear in Scripture that men and women are to have different roles and responsibilities in marriage, and that's what we don't like. We don't like the fact that we're supposed to do different things, or we have different terms that describe who we are to be in our marriages. We look at them through this lens of fairness, and we say, well, that's not fair that he gets to do that and I have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And so we look askance and with criticism, rather than going back to the big picture and looking at it as God designed it to be and saying objectively and with a teachable heart, well, what did God have in mind? And what might I be missing by assuming the worst, by believing the worst about God and His intentions for me as a woman in particular?
I think one of the things they were struggling with is, I love the line that said, no one told me that I had to not only raise kids, but had to raise my husband too. And you responded to that one as well.
Well, I think so often we women assume that that's our responsibility. And again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, that changing him or fixing him is not a part of our job. And what happens so often with us women when we get married is it's not often as confusing in the beginning, but once we have kids and once we become mom, and so we're mom and wife, the mom part gets mixed up with the wife part. And so all day long, I'm working with my kids. I'm helping them tie their shoes. I'm telling them to say please and thank you. I'm telling them to pick up their clothes. Be nice to your sister. Be nice to your brother. Apologize. Say you forgive one another. All of that over and over and over. And so it's hard sometimes for that not to seep over into my marriage relationship. And we say, well, why don't you pick up your clothes? You should pick up your clothes. You should say please. You should say thank you. And all of a sudden, we are mothering our husbands instead of being a helper. And it's a fine line. It takes many, many years to learn exactly what that looks like, to learn what God wants it to be. And I might say that it's different in every marriage. And that's what I love so much about God's design, is He has given us some very basic direction for what marriage is supposed to be. And one of my names as a wife is to be helper.
Yes.
And the way I help Dennis is not going to be the same way that your wife helps you, because you're two different people, and your needs are different, and your desires are different, and your preferences are different. And so my job as a wife is to learn my husband, and for him to learn me, conversely, and for us to learn each other, and then to perform what God has called us to do in that marriage in light of who we are. So helping my husband is very different than helping my children. I help my children because I'm their parent and I'm the authority figure in their life. But I am not my husband's parent, nor am I his authority figure. And so helping him looks very different than helping children. And so that's a dilemma that takes many, many years for women to figure out, because there isn't an instruction booklet. God wants us to depend on him. He wants us to pray. He wants us to have conversations as a couple and figure out what that is, because we're all different and we're all unique, and God wants us to have a unique facets to our marriage, so that my marriage is going to look different than yours and everyone else's, and yet together we're still all reflecting the intentions of God when he designed marriage in the first place.
Talk about instruction booklet. This is certainly one. As you read through it, I suspect some of you that are older like we are would say, I wish I'd known that back in my 20s. But again, some great wisdom coming from Barbara Rainey as we talk about her book, Letters to My Daughters, The Art of Being a Wife, published by Bethany House. Let's see if we can move into the idea of marriage is like a beautiful dancing, because you're, again, talking about leadership, and maybe we'll talk about the positive then the negative, because certainly one of the other questions in that was, what if I feel my husband's leading us in the wrong direction? But first of all, just this idea of learning to dance. You like to dance, and those of us that have done dance, somebody has to lead and somebody has to follow, and that's just the nature of the physics of it all, the nature of dancing, and the nature of what God designed, right?
Correct. And that's another one of those differences. When we got married, I loved dancing, and my husband doesn't know how to dance, and he's not real good at it. He doesn't have a whole lot of natural rhythm, and so that was just never a part of our marriage. But about, 10 years ago, our kids gave us some dancing lessons for our Christmas gift, and I was tickled to death. I was so excited about this. And my sweet husband good-naturedly said, sure, we'll give that a try. And I thought it was so instructive for me, because I thought going into these dance lessons that I knew a lot, and I thought, I'm going to get this in a snap. This is going to be easy for me, and I'll help him, and together we'll figure it out. And I learned very quickly that when I was trying to help him, I wasn't doing what I needed to be doing. And when I tried to help him, he wasn't paying attention to the instructor. And it was so helpful for me to realize that my husband, as the leader, needed to be listening to the instructor, not me. When I was trying to help him, he was distracted, and he didn't know who to listen to. But when I got out of the way and I concentrated on following his lead in the dance, then he was free to listen to the instructor, and he made fewer mistakes when I wasn't helping, and he apologized a lot more quickly when he did, and we made much better progress when we were each focusing on our part of the dance. There are so many analogies in dancing to marriage, because you cannot do a dance without one person leading and one person following. It's just not possible. And I like it that you use the word physics, because it is a physics issue. It's impossible to have two leaders in a dance. And so when you think about dancing, you have to realize that it, as an illustration of marriage, we each have different roles to play, and that's not bad. We've thought of the word role as being negative and evil, and it's a terrible thing, but it's not a terrible thing. And when you think about dance competitions that are now on TV, I don't know if you watch them or how many of your listeners watch them, but when you watch those dances, they're exquisite, they're perfect, they're beautiful, but who is the star of the duo? It's not the man, it's the woman. She's got the prettier costume, she's the one that gets twirled and lifted, and she is the focal point of the whole dance. And it's because she's the star. And the reason she can be the star is because she follows her partner's lead. He's the one who lifts her up. He's the one who makes her twirl, who makes her spin, who allows her to be the focal point of the dance. And so when you learn to work together as a couple, each one listening to the music, listening to the choreography, following the instructor that God is in our marriages, then you're going to play the part that God wanted you to play. And really what women long for is women long to be lifted up. We long to be the one that's twirling, the one that has on the most beautiful costume. But when we're trying to do what our husband's supposed to be doing, we can't do that. So the whole conclusion of the dancing illustration for us as women in particular is focus on what God has given you to do. Focus on following your husband's lead. And again, it's going to be different than any other man you know, and that's okay. You're not married to all those other men. You're only married to one. And you got to figure out who he is, what he needs, and how you can follow him. And when you do that, then your part of the dance is going to be much easier and much more beautiful.
Talking with Barbara Rainey about her book, Letters to My Daughters, The Art of Being a Wife. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about marriage is like a secret garden. Marriage is like masterful photography. Marriage is like a watercolor painting. And again, we encourage you to find out more about that. You can find it on our website, pointofview.net. It's published by Bethany House. You'll probably be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to order it as well. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for just a few more minutes Barbara Rainey as we talk about her book, Letters to My Daughters, The Art of Being a Wife. And in the section on marriage is like masterful photography, you talk about the fact that the story of your marriage is really one for you to frame and to develop. And really it gets us back to the issue of focus. Good photography requires you to be able to frame the picture, to be able to focus it, to understand lighting, to understand some of the filters. And you use some of these illustrations to once again help us understand that how we frame our marriage, whether we're going to think good about this or whether we're going to join in when some of the women around a table talk about all the flaws of their marriage and their husbands, is a choice that each individual needs to make.
And Kerby, this is Dennis. I just walked up and the picture looks so good. Excuse me while I kiss the picture.
That is so good. This is
so
fun.
There's the spontaneous man that I married.
There you go. We haven't done that on
He said,
live
I
radio
want to
too
say
often.
hi to, yeah, I'm sure you don't. He said, I want to say something. And I said, you're being your spontaneous self, right?
Well, say hello to him. We certainly have enjoyed having him in studio over these years.
Well, good.
Yeah.
Well, I did hear the question, even though he was eavesdropping. So we can talk about the photography. You know, I've noticed in our culture that we've become very comfortable and free with saying exactly what we think and how we feel without regard to how that might make the other person feel or what kind of a light that would put them in. And it's especially discouraging with marriages because so often what people know about my husband is what they hear from me or the light that I put him in or the way I talk about our marriage. I may not be talking about him, but I may be talking about our relationship in terms that's not attractive, that doesn't put him or our relationship in the best light, and certainly doesn't put the creator of marriage, God himself, in a good light. And so I talk about photography because when you, as you just said, when you want to take a picture of something that's beautiful, you have to select what you're going to focus on and what you're going to leave out of the shot. You can't get everything in the lens. You can only get certain things in. And as the photographer, you have a choice what you're going to focus on. You can choose what you want to leave out and what you want to leave in. And I think in marriage, we're very much like that. It's like we have a camera in our hands, and as we talk about one another, as we talk about our relationship, we need to choose what we say very, very carefully because words are powerful and they can't be taken back. And we're really good at speaking the truth, but we forget the in love part. Mm-hmm. And so in marriage, it's more important than any other relationship because those words can create powerful heartache and difficulty and pain, and it's very hard to undo them because you can't bring them back. So thinking about our marriage that way, it helps me understand that I have a responsibility to communicate with my words what is really true about our marriage. Everybody doesn't need to know what's wrong with it. And this is especially true with families because it's easy sometimes with your sister or with your mom to kind of bash your husband or to make light of things that he's said or to tease him in a way that wouldn't be embarrassing. And that's painting a picture for your mom or your sister or your friend. And they're likely not to forget that. You might forget it, but they're likely going to remember that, and they're going to see him that way from then on, unless it's corrected by you.
Well said. Let me end with your chapter on marriage is like a watercolor painting. First of all, of course, you're quite an artist, and it is, I think, a good example that watercolor is perhaps one of the most unforgiving of all medium, because if indeed you let a little bit go into one area that you didn't intend and try to cover it over, you end up, as you said, with mud. And yet, at the same time, we live in a world where sometimes it's light, sometimes it's dark, sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's difficult. Just before we run out of time, talk about how you can take some of the things that we've talked about here in your book and in your life and begin to apply those to your marriage.
Well, all marriages, as we said earlier, are going to struggle. All marriages are going to have seasons of winter. We're all going to have seasons when it just feels like nothing is going right. Everything's going wrong. It just can't possibly get any harder. And those are the dark places. And I describe watercolor painting, and one of the hardest things for me to learn when I was taking lessons again after our youngest was in high school was that when you add dark color to a canvas, it just feels wrong because I didn't want to mess up my happy colors. But I learned that when there are grays or muted colors or dark colors added next to the bright colors, then the light shines better. And I think it's a perfect illustration of what God knows is best. God knows that sometimes we need those difficulties to help us see Him. And when we do, and when we persevere together as a couple through those hard seasons, through those valleys or those winters, we come through on the other side stronger and brighter because that dark season, that hard season, has made the light that much brighter once we understand what God was trying to do with us. So I think thinking of our lives as a painting, thinking of our marriages as a painting, is a good analogy for helping us see the big picture. God's not through just because we're in a hard spot. He's not, we're not beyond repair. We're not beyond hope. We're not beyond help when we're in a difficult time. Just like a painting, when you see the dark colors, isn't finished yet. There's much light to be applied. There are many light colors that can be applied that will balance that out. We just have to be patient and trust God's timing and His sovereignty over our lives to bring that light to the forefront once again.
A lot of people refer to this as a treasure of a book, and it really is, because it not only has all sorts of great common sense advice, but again, paintings and photographs and poems and a lot that you have brought to the table. So, Barbara, it's just been a delight to have you on the program. I'm ordering multiple copies of the book, giving it to everybody that I know, and thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks, Kerby. It was fun to talk about this, and I appreciate you having me on.
And it was fun to have Dennis jump in for a second. We need to get him back on as well.
Mr. Spontaneous.
Mr. Spontaneous. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into another topic. But let me just mention that we do have an action alert up for you today, and that action alert has to do with something that is of grave concern to us, and it's called the Equality Act. We're going to talk a lot more about that over the next couple of days, but I did want to let you know that it is now up. This is a place where I think your religious freedom could really be under attack, and we'll spend some time tomorrow with Kelly Shackelford talking more about it. But if the bill is passed, it would add sexual orientation and gender identity to 25 existing federal laws, make sexual orientation and gender identity equal to sex and race. Well, we've heard about that before, but this one actually goes much further, and that it expands the definition of public accommodations and a variety of other things, which I think could really significantly have an impact on the church. So one of the things we're encouraging you to do is, those of you that receive email will be receiving an email, if you have not already, from me explaining that. But if you go to our website right now, pointofview.net, you will see under our action alert, the Equality Act, your religious freedom under attack. We give you some basic information, then we encourage you to click on that button that says Take Action. Then we have some suggested comments that you might want to send to your representative, and as soon as you log in, it will understand where you live. In many cases, you've already logged in the past, so it's already taken care of. If this is the first time you've ever done it, you'll need to put your name and address in there so that it can make sure that it sends you to the right representative. And so even if you do not know who your representative is, or you have never taken the time to even check that out, we've made that very easy for you. And I've had all sorts of people say, I never have written to my member of Congress until you made it so easy. So today we are launching our concern about the Equality Act and encouraging you to contact your representatives. We'll talk a whole lot more about this, but I wanted to let you know that that is now up on our website, pointofview.net. And for those of you that are ready to take action, just go there, maybe even during the break, and take action. We'll be back with more right after this.
From Focus Features in association with Motive Entertainment comes The Young Messiah.
You seek a family from Nazareth with a boy named Jesus.
The Young Messiah imagines the journey of Jesus with his family from Egypt to Nazareth and on to Jerusalem, where his identity is revealed and his destiny fulfilled.
He's just a child.
He is not just a child.
In theaters March 11th. Rated PG-13, may not be appropriate for children under 13. More information at youngmessiahresources.com. Are you concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, and the halls of government? Let me ask, have you invested in things that yield a good harvest? If you're already giving to Point of View each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
On Point of View, we spend a fair amount of time looking at cultural trends. In this hour, we're going to focus on that once again. This book that we'll be talking about is a perfect follow-up to an interview we just did a couple of days ago with Josh McDowell and Sean McDowell about their book, this new book, Good Faith, Being a Christian When Society Thinks You're Irrelevant and Extreme. We're going to talk about extremism, how people view religious extremism, irrelevance. Is Christianity and religious people, are they irrelevant? What about this idea of a new moral code and some of the kinds of conversations we have to have with our friends and relatives, and certainly the whole issue of the homosexual agenda and how that is perceived and how that is misperceived in terms of how Christians actually think about this. And again, you just can't do any better than having our two guests with us. Dave Kinnaman is the president of Barna Group. He is the author, of course, of this book, as well as You Lost Me, and a co-author of the book Unchristian. And we also have Gabe Lyons with us, who is also the co-author of that book Unchristian and is the founder of Q Ideas, a learning community, as well as author of The Next Christians. And both of you guys, I appreciate it. David, first of all, thank you so much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having us, Kerby.
And Gabe, thank you for joining us as well.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, let's get into it. You have already in early part of the book talked about the fact that more than 2 out of 5 Americans believe that when it comes to what happens in the country today, people of faith or people that are religious are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Dave, that seems to me to suggest that we're going to find ourselves more and more marginalized in the culture, don't you think?
I think so. I mean, that's really the basis of this whole study, was to look at the perceptions of today's Christians about their role in culture. And a majority of Christians are feeling marginalized, they're feeling sidelined, and really the results bear this out, that a huge percentage of the population actually thinks that Christians and people of faith are part of the problem. As you said, 2 in every 5 Americans believe that's the problem.
Gabe, it seems to me that that's also part of what we see in the millennial generation, those individuals that are saying, hey, religion's not important to me, so it's either extreme or it's irrelevant. In either case, it's much more difficult than it used to be to even share your faith with somebody that's in the millennial generation.
Well, I think in general, as you stated, religion is seen as a pretty high negative. 46% of Americans believe religion's part of the problem also. And so I think we can understand that. You see the rise in true extremism, which would be physical death for people who disagree with your point of view, as we've seen in ISIS, the Middle East. And I think people are reacting to that in American life, too, going, man, if religion's creating those kind of problems around the world, I wonder if that could ever happen here. And so I think there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and it's kind of the perfect storm. People are already hesitant to engage in religion, and now they have a good excuse to stay away from it.
I mentioned, and I'll let either of you respond to it, these difficult conversations that we have, because sometimes it's difficult. And I'm having people say, I don't even want to be identified as a Christian. I don't want to be identified as an evangelical. I think that is such a negative that I would rather just go around pretending that I'm more secular minded, because it's just an easier way to cope with some of the tensions that I run into when I just have a conversation at a Starbucks.
Yeah, I mean, and then in an election year, difficult conversations are even more difficult. And I think this is part of the effort in the research and the book to describe how it is that Christians can have meaningful, effective conversations with friends, coworkers, family members, people who you disagree with, try to understand the heart behind people who have a different point of view, how to represent Jesus well in those difficult conversations. it's a really very difficult context right now to have a meaningful conversation. We try to coach you about how to do that.
Well, we'll certainly talk about that. But let's go back to when you released Unchristian back in 2007. Gabe, I'll chat with you just for a second to talk about that, because even then it seemed to me, and that's years ago now, I mean, we're almost talking about 9 years ago, you had already the idea that the church had sort of what you might call an outsider's view. Explain that if you might.
Yeah, part of the research there laid out how 16 to 29-year-olds at that time were feeling about the church, and they really described us as a group of people who were judgmental, too political, we were hypocritical, we only cared about proselytizing, and so the church really was being indicted about this one big idea that we'd become self-righteous, that we'd maybe become too religious. And so I think what's encouraging, though, is we've looked over the last decade, you start to see that the church is waking up to that. I think we see more and more churches today who do care about their communities, who do care about their faith being something that's not just a set of beliefs, but it's something in action. And that's a lot of what David and I did on this current project, was really try to lay out in good faith that good faith is not just about what you believe. While that's critical, it's foundational, it's important, it also has to do a lot with how you live and how you love. And if you divorce and take away any one of those three items, you end up with either really bad religion, or you end up with a lifestyle that maybe loves people, but you're not really bringing any truth to bear in their life.
Let's see if we can maybe talk about some of the various concerns. And I might just mention that as we are going through this conversation with David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons, we also have information about this book, Good Faith. It's published by Baker. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a way for you to order it. Also have a link to barna.org as well as qideas.org. But one of the things I learned very early on is, David, you enjoy board games about as much as I do, which is like none. And you use that as a great illustration of having to sit down with your brother and learn all these games, and after a while it's like blah 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 blah, because because the rules to some of these really arcane and detailed games go beyond you. And you use that as an illustration that in some respects today, when Christians talk or when they try to communicate, it's almost like background noise to our secular culture, isn't it?
It is, and I thought that was a fun example. It happens to be true. I like a few board games, but not very many. And I know a lot of people enjoy them, but it's for me, my brother taught me 7 or 8 games over a course of 3 or 4 nights, and it just reminded me of what it must be like for somebody who's not a Christian, as we're trying to tell them about all these rules to life that we believe the Bible instructs us to live. And so Christianity is increasingly irrelevant. It feels like something that matters to somebody else, and it's great if it matters to them, but don't try to convince me to play the game with you. And I think this is part of what's happening in our culture, is that you can live a pretty good life without Christianity if we're really being honest, and even scriptures tell us that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, and there's like God blesses people just because He created us all, and He loves us as humans. And so I think this idea of how do we represent Jesus in a new world where many of those rules they just don't, we've presented a form of Christianity that's really about rules and rule following, as opposed to about the heart of the gospel, which changes us as humans.
Well, and again, we are certainly going to spend some time talking about how to move from irrelevance to good faith and extremism and a number of other things, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks, so we'll come back and continue our conversation today with Dave Kinnaman, who again is the president of Barna Group, as well as Gabe Lyons, founder of Q Ideas, and we have links to both of those websites. This book is one that you really need to have on your shelf and need to read it, especially if you have benefited in the past from the book that they put together called Unchristian. And I have done whole messages on this. We've talked with them about this in the past. It is certainly a very important resource for you, but this is a great updated piece. 275 pages, published by Baker Books. You can look for it in your local bookstore, but we have links so that you can find it there as well. And we're going to spend some time not only identifying the problem, but how do we move from problems like extremism and irrelevance to good faith? That's the topic. We'll begin to focus a little bit more on that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
America's in the midst of a heroin epidemic. Last month, the National Governors Association accepted a proposal to establish guidelines on prescribing the painkillers that are abused and often lead to heroin abuse. If that sounds like a backward way to deal with heroin addiction, consider these facts. According to the New York Times, 75% of heroin addicts use these prescription painkillers before turning to heroin. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control reports that 45% of people who used heroin were also addicted to prescription painkillers. So why did this happen? Well, in previous decades, prescription painkillers became cheap and plentiful. When authorities began to crack down on unscrupulous doctors who were overprescribing pain meds, addicts began searching for alternatives. Many chose heroin. The heroin epidemic is upon us because of demand and supply. The demand was fueled by many already addicted to painkillers looking for another high. But we should also look at supply. Ann Coulter, in a recent column, reminds us that it is harder to stay away from drugs when Mexico is flooding the country with them. The amount of heroin seized at the border increased sixfold from 2007 to 2013, and heroin use doubled during that same period. Not only are illegal immigrants coming across the border, so are illegal drugs. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman has been in the news because of his prison escape. But he also bragged that he supplied more heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana than anybody else in the world. And I might also add that these drug lords are also bringing in lots of prescription painkillers. We need not only crack down on prescription drug abuse, but we also need to close our border to illegal drug trafficking. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk with David Kinnaman as well as Gabe Lyons. And by the way, if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. This may be one of those programs where you just want to sit back and listen, maybe take some notes. But if, as we talk about some of these issues, you'd like to join our conversation at any point, 1-800-351-1212. The book is entitled Good Faith, Being a Christian When Society Thinks You're Irrelevant and Extreme. And these are individuals that have written in the past this very excellent book called Unchristian that we've quoted from many times on the program, and I've actually spoken on that as well, and so we are privileged to have them talking about this new book published by Baker. And Gabe, let me come to you for just a minute. Extreme. There's the wrong kind of extreme and the right kind of extreme, if you think about it, because sometimes, even if you are following biblical principles and you do that in gracious ways, people will call you extreme anyway. But there are other kinds of wrong kinds of extreme. Can you explain?
Yeah, the idea of extreme, the word gets thrown around so much these days, but I think anytime you're devoted to something very seriously, you take it seriously, you practice it in your life, it's extreme. I mean, some people think taking a Sabbath is extreme because you've committed a day of your life where you're not going to produce. And in the research, amazingly, Americans feel like it's extreme if they see you on the street actually praying over somebody or praying for them. That's an extreme behavior. 42% of Americans believe if you quit a good-paying job to go pursue a mission field or a job that's more on mission in a foreign country, that's extreme. So you're seeing the word used quite a bit. I think as Christians, what David and I argue is that there is a good type of extreme. Extremely committed, extremely faithful, extremely diligent. But we can't just be cast out on the edges to where we're embodying these attitudes and behaviors that are extreme and not be loving. I think if we're devoted to our faith, but we're activated in how we love people in our communities, on the job, in relationships, in the real conversations people want to have, it actually offsets their feeling that we're super weird. I think Christians are called to probably be pretty weird during this time. It doesn't mean we have to be off-putting. It doesn't mean we reject people, but it means we live lives that are counter to the culture. That's what the idea of counterculture means. But in 2016 and beyond, I think it's going to take a new kind of focus and a new kind of commitment to understanding what have we bought into that's not really Christianity, and what does it mean to truly be devoted to living out our faith.
Dave, one of the things that maybe illustrates that point is, in addition to the Barna survey you did on what some people consider to be extreme, you also had a section on people with whom it's difficult to have a conversation. And at the top of the list, you might imagine Muslims. I mean, a lot of Christians say, I'm not sure I can talk to my Muslim friend, but Mormons, atheists, going all the way down the list. And so sometimes extreme just means I just don't feel comfortable even having a conversation with somebody that has those particular sets of viewpoints. True?
Absolutely. And I think this is the moment that we're in, again, looking at the election, looking at a lot of things that are happening in American culture. We have a more tribal experience. That means there are more people who are skeptics. There are atheists and agnostics. We have more Muslims in our country today than we've ever had before. The growth and prominence of the LGBT community. Evangelicals are still a very prominent segment, but we're a very small slice of the total population. So we have all these different tribes, all these different segments, and we're all living together with our own forms of extremism. And that's part of really what the research shows is that, for a Muslim to practice their faith, there's certain things that they do that are extremist to the rest of us. And for an evangelical to practice our faith, it is extremist to other people. So how do we have a pluralistic, healthy society? Of course, as biblically minded Christians, we believe that part of our mission is to help to evangelize and disciple those people that God puts us in the midst of. But to have a very effective pluralistic society, we have to find a way to have these very difficult conversations. One of my neighbors, a good friend, is a former Christian, now an atheist, and it's very difficult to have a meaningful conversation on things other than just about basketball. And those are fun and good too. Yes. But how do we have these important, meaningful conversations about the things that we believe? Because as evangelicals, we think that those beliefs actually do matter. There's a reason we hold to those beliefs. They actually are what God has instructed human beings to do and to think about these very complex issues.
Well, again, there are 3 sections to this book. Part 1 is Understanding Our Times. We certainly could spend more time there, but I want to move on to Part 2, Living Good Faith. What does that look like? And you certainly talk about this in a couple of ways. Love, believe, and live. Certainly we need to live out our Christian life in a way that is not hypocritical. And you also talk about listening more than talking. It does seem to me that a really responsible Christian, especially if you're involved in evangelism or apologetics or just even wanting to be a good neighbor, sometimes listening and asking questions are a lot more important than you just simply starting to speak and sharing your biblical ideas, because if you're already perceived as being extreme and irrelevant, that's going to be difficult to win a hearing. True?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of the message of this project, what we've learned over the last few years, is how to interact in a lot of different places. At our business at Barna, we get to work with a lot of mainstream businesses and media. Gabe, Lyons at Q is working with a lot of different leaders. We're both very committed to the evangelical theology and the fact that we want to see the world transformed for Christ. And yet we're living in this very complicated world. And so part of it is to actually be able to see people for who they are. There's an interesting story that came up for me where I was sitting next to a young Muslim woman on a public transport one day, and a guy came through and was asking for money. And I remember sort of like just quickly judging the young woman about whatever, just being Muslim, I guess. And this guy came through and asked for money, and she was the one who gave this guy some money. And I remember just feeling like all my categories were rewritten right there, because I had judged the beggar and judged the Muslim woman, and I was the one that was the least generous in the whole exchange. And it's just so easy for us to be, as Christians, feeling like we're on the right side of all these issues. And that's why I think Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, because he's essentially saying that, listen, the religious person who you expect to help may or may not actually follow through on their commitments. They don't actually live with good faith. And the person that you least expect is the one that might actually do right. And so I think this is part of the journey that Gabe and I have been on. Certainly we have some things we've learned, sometimes the hard way, and this idea of seeing people, listening to others, recognizing it's easy to try to say what we believe first, but it's actually a more disciplined thing to exercise the fruits of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control. And that we have to be characterized by those things in our interactions with people around us.
Gabe, I talked about questions. You have a whole chapter here, the right questions. Good faith Christians engage culture by asking what is wrong, what is confused, what is right, and what is missing. It seems to me that we need to know how to ask good questions. I mean, if you think about it, Jesus probably asked as many questions as he gave answers. And so if that was the model of our Savior, it certainly seems to be something that should be part of our lifestyle.
Yeah, you're right, Kerby. I mean, we try to lay out these questions to be simple and clear that Christians throughout the ages have been asking and responding to these questions. But I think we've forgotten. Sometimes it's easy for Christians to answer the one question, sometimes the simplest, what is wrong? And we go, man, there's a lot wrong in our culture, and our response can sometimes be to condemn those things, to point out what's wrong with them. We challenge readers to confront and stop the things around them that are wrong. That is a job you have to take on. You have to activate around that. But we also say there's some other questions Christians should ask, like, for example, what is right? What are the things in our community that are good, that we do want to celebrate, that we want to affirm and lift up? How can we as Christians be even better at that? When we see our neighbor doing good, let's catch them in the act of doing good and celebrate that. The same way I know parenting books have taught me to parent my children. But we also have to answer questions like, what's confused? We need people to be more clear these days. There's a lot of confusion in our world about basic things, human relationships, sexuality. What does it mean for Christians to engage a new kind of political and public square where being a Christian is becoming a liability? So we need to clarify in those areas and compel people forward. So Q, our organization, is kind of built on this premise, Kerby, that questions matter. We shouldn't just dictate answers to everybody all the time. We should ask good questions, be thoughtful about how we're going to engage. And a lot of what we try to describe in this book are the stories of Christians who are finding creative ways to engage some of these very difficult conversations.
Well, again, one of the things we encourage you to do is visit the website. We have a link to barna.org as well as qideas.org. Both of them are there, and you'll find out a lot more about both of these excellent organizations and quite a bit about Dave Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons. But we need to take another one of those breaks. When we come back, we'll get into some of those issues. And if you'd like to join us, we already have a call or two coming in, so you can join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. What about marriage and family and sex, and what about racial issues and different ways in which we as believers can be faithful? And then finally, we'll get into that third section, and that is the church in our future. So just a lot of very good, helpful material, as well as a lot of background research in this book, Good Faith. It has about 275 pages. It is published by Baker. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have information about it in case you would like to order it immediately. Let's take a break. But if you'd like to join the conversation, we will get to some of those phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about good faith, being a Christian when society thinks you're irrelevant and extreme. If you just joined us, we've been talking about how there is a lot of evidence to suggest that that is a perception that the world has of us, that we are very extreme, that religious extremism is danger, how we can actually have a positive impact. And guys, since for a moment one of our callers wants to talk about race, some of the other calls I thought would get to that one, because in the chapters here you focus on all sorts and that it is irrelevant to the way in which people live. And so those is race and prejudice. And you say good faith Christians admit their racial bias, see the image of God in others, and build diverse friendships. You shared a little bit about the fact that sometimes you felt a little bit out of your depth, but how do we think about this issue of race in America? It's certainly a very important issue.
Well, it is, Kerby. I think one of the things most Americans realized over the last 2 years is it's a topic that has gotten swept under the covers, and we did think, maybe I know I did as a white male, I thought that, man, we'd moved past this season in American life where racism was strong. That was until I started spending more times with my African-American brothers and sisters and having conversations and trying to understand their perspective. And I found myself realizing something, that while I wasn't racist, I wasn't expressing racism in any way, that all of us in some ways have something I would describe as implicit racial bias. So it's not explicit, you're not trying to be racist, but there's certain ways you just filter information, stereotypes, the way we perceive and think about people who are different, to not see the image of God in someone, but instead start with our stereotypes. And so that was something I had to repent of. And along that, different than us can always lead us, same line, realize that the solution to that is going to come truly through friendship. It's that if you look at your speed dial, this is one of the things my friend Chris Hewarts likes to say, look at your speed dial and your last 10 calls, and if they're all to people who are like you, look like you, and in my case would be just white people, then I'm not going to have diversity in my life. And I'm the one who's the poorer for that. Like, it's a poverty of my own life and friendships that I'm not experiencing the rich diversity of this world. So we need to lead. We have an opportunity as Christians in the current race discussions to lead, to be those who understand the depths of this conversation and aren't willing to just look away or blame or tell people that they need to get over it. No, we need to actually sit alongside them and see it through their lens.
You've talked about some of that in your Q conference, but let me bring in one of the callers that wanted to ask a question. So we'll head out to Georgia first. Paulette, you're on with Dave Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons.
Yes, sir. I work for a major retail company, and we have a lot of diversity. And I was raised in Miami, and I had black people go to my school. We all got along real good, and I've got along real good with these people up here, but recently, and I think it's because of TV, that they see all this racial profiling thing, that they accuse white people, falsely accuse white people of being racially profiling. When I have friends that I love, and they love me, and they're black, and I have been accused of doing that today, and I just don't understand it, because I'm not that kind of person. I love everybody, and we're supposed to love one another, like Jesus said, and treat everybody the way we want to be treated, and that's what I do.
Well, let me get you some comments. So, Gabe, let me come to you, because that kind of gets back to, on the one hand, we have to look at ourselves, but sometimes people will accuse us of something that we're not really guilty of. How do you sort that through?
Yeah, Paulette, I mean, I definitely feel the pain of what your experience is like in your voice, just like having invested in friendships, but then feeling like some outside source is sort of messing all that up. And it's the media, or it's news stories, or it's, communities that have decided, hey, white people are the problem. And this is, I guess, the point, is that this day requires difficult conversations with your friends. And the fact that you're already invested in relationships with people who are different than you, who look different than you, who come from different cultures, and you appreciate those cultures, you are demonstrating that. And those friends, if they're in relationship with you, they're not going to turn their back on that. They're going to see this as a rich way for them to continue to build diversity in their own life. But we do have to be aware, Kerby, and I think the bigger point is that the media is constantly, they make money off of creating division. It's going to take people like us, like your listeners, to be the ones who do build these bridges, who can overcome those perceptions, because the practices of our life are going to demonstrate something differently. And I hope, Paulette, for you see and feel celebrated that you're actually doing that, and that you'll endure that you won't give up on that. In these moments where your faith is really tested, this is when you really practice the walking by faith that the Bible teaches us to do.
Let's, if we can, maybe move to the issue of a gay conversation. And Gabe, I'll come to you in just a minute, but I thought I'd come back to David because you've actually done some surveys on Americans' view of marriage. And one of the things that certainly has clouded any kind of conversation between, say, the Christian community and the LGBT community is the issue of marriage and same-sex marriage. On the one hand, I can affirm you as a person, but I would disagree about the fact that we should redefine marriage. But what have you found in terms of the way in which various Americans look at this issue of marriage today?
Well, I think one of the things that isn't often told in the stories in media, and again, I think Paulette is raising a really right point, which is that the media is creating a certain set of perceptions about biblical orthodoxy, that it's on the wrong side of history, or that nobody believes it, and if you believe it, it's just a sort of a bigoted position. But actually, most practicing Christians, the vast majority, still hold a traditional view towards marriage, the vast majority of Protestant pastors believe that the church should hold to its historic teaching. I think there certainly has been a lot of movement in Americans' attitudes about the LGBT community, and frankly, I think all conservative Christians would say they've come to realize ways in which they've been very self-righteous about picking on this particular issue above other issues.
Right.
But recognizing the fact that this is a pretty significant one, is maybe the most difficult conversation people can have in our times today about sex and sexuality. And certainly it represents, a very tough issue, contentious issue, as maybe a kid comes out to their parent, or a young Christian is struggling with same-sex attraction. And so just recognizing that these are the kinds of difficult conversations that need to be had, and that this is a very sacred trust that we have as we're having these particular kinds of discussions, because the other person is a soul, is a person who's made in the image of God, and we have to be very careful with how it is that we represent biblical truth in that conversation.
Let's, if we can, and I want to bring Gabe in just a minute, but let's maybe put Ivan on, because he is dealing with an issue, listening to WLPE. And it sounds to me, as I'm reading on the screen here, Ivan, that you have a family member that is homosexual and is wanting to get married. Tell us a little bit more. Ivan, are you with us? We'll put Ivan on hold here, and I think that was kind of the question he had. And Gabe, what about this? Because oftentimes we want to have a conversation, and good faith Christians love their gay friends and trust God's design for sexuality, but trying to deal with where that line is obviously a very important issue, isn't it?
Yeah, we think there's actually a really clear line, and the line is our theology. What do we really believe God's design is? We believe God's design is that sexuality and sex was meant to be between a man and a woman inside of a covenant, committed marriage, and anything else means we remain celibate, as we do as single individuals. And I think we understand that line is drawn because we as Christians have to know, what did God build us to do? How did he design us? How does the world flourish? How do we flourish? And when we start there and we have confidence in what we believe to be true about the world, it gives us actually a lot of freedom to then start to understand, how do we express love, even if we disagree with our neighbor. Maybe our friend invites us to a wedding, and it's a gay marriage, gay wedding taking place. How do you engage that? Well, I have some friends who absolutely would go because they have such a close relationship with this person. They're showing up not out of endorsement of a gay wedding, but out of friendship to a person. There are others who would say, absolutely, I would never do that because I don't want to be showing any kind of support for that. And I think good Christians are going to disagree on this. My pastor friends would say, look, it's very clear for us as pastors that we're not able to perform a gay wedding. That goes completely against our theology. That would never even be an option. But I also think as in the days ahead, we all have relationships and friendships, and it could be our own children, it could be a parent, it could be a colleague, a coworker, as your caller was suggesting. And I think what the need is in the future is we have to go forward and live out love, and we have to live out kindness and compassion and engage with people who are different than us. We can hold tightly to what we believe. You don't have to compromise that just because you're in relationship with people who are different than us. And in fact, in many ways, the church needs to do better with how we do engage people who have same-sex attraction. Many times the church is the absolute last place they would ever want to go to explore those feelings and to try to better understand what is happening. We believe it's incumbent upon the church to be the first place people would want to go to try to understand, why do they have these feelings? What are they supposed to do with that? How is the ideas that we learn about in Scripture, and what does Jesus have to say about how we live our lives? How do we deny ourselves, sometimes of desire, sometimes of things we want really bad, but aren't what God's best is for us?
We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons as we talk about their book, Good Faith. Yvonne, WLPE, what is your story? Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. My oldest son, by my first marriage, he called me around Thanksgiving and asked my advice about, he has a half-sister, and she announced to him that she was gay, that she is gay, and she's getting ready to get married, and since my son is older than her, she wanted him to announce her marriage. And she also wanted to be invited to their big Thanksgiving dinner and bring her partner, or I don't know if they had married yet. And So I wanted some advice on how, if I could have given them better advice. I told him he did fine. I thought he told her no, he would not do that. That was against his faith. He could not announce her marriage, and that at that time he didn't feel comfortable inviting her to the Thanksgiving meal.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate your question. I think there's a lot of people that feel like you, who they just want to give good, sound advice. We want to be faithful to what we believe, but we also want to be loving and kind. And there's a lot of dynamics to every one of these stories, you know, whether the person's a Christian or not. That matters, because if somebody doesn't profess to be a Christian, then they don't really choose to live by the same rules that maybe Christians do. And so there's a little bit of a different way that you might handle that than if it's somebody inside the church. But I would also say, as it relates to family, as it relates to Thanksgiving dinners, you know, my suggestion is to embrace and welcome people to be at our tables with one another, even when we might have disagreement with their life, maybe the disagreement with choices that they've made. I think we have to, you know, be careful and thoughtful about bringing discussions up around the dinner table. How old are your children? Do they understand what's happening? I think we can all get through that, though, and I think we probably need to get through that, because this difficult conversation that you've engaged in and that he was engaging in, it isn't going to go away. There's going to be more and more of these in the days ahead, and we have to lead with love. We can't be fearful, but you can hold to your convictions. This is what I think a lot of people don't understand as Christians. You can hold tightly to what you believe and your convictions, and you can also just put forward incredible love for people, and it doesn't mean you've compromised your conviction. And so whether I would announce a wedding or you know, however that plays out in their context, he absolutely shouldn't do that if it goes against his conscience. That's the freedom and right that he has. But I would say inside relationship, you know, hopefully that person would know that and wouldn't ask that of them, because they know it's compromising their relationship. It has to be a two-way street. And I think in American life, we're going to need a lot more practice in understanding how we're going to get along despite having some of these great differences.
Might mention the book also by Sean McDowell and John Stonestreet on same-sex marriage, because it has a lot of those kinds of questions in there, so that's one way to get to it. And let's take at least one more phone call before we get into 5 ways to be faithful. So we'll go to WAGP. Dennis, you're on with David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons. What would you like to add?
Well, my wife has this quilt hanging on the wall. It's 2 Chronicles 7:14 of my people.
Sure.
And naturally, I've looked at that many times over the years, and that seems like it's pretty foundational to what our country's problems are. It's not what the LGBT people are doing. It's not what the abortion people are doing. That's not the foundation. The foundation is what we're not doing as believers. And all these other things have come in because we left the door open. Nobody's guarding the door. And we're not guarding the door because we're not doing what we're supposed to do. And I haven't heard you mention that. I'd just like to know what you think of that.
Well, it kind of brings us to that whole section there on 5 ways to be faithful. Both David and Gabe, can you maybe help us understand how we can be faithful Christians? Because, as you pointed out, even in your earlier book on Christian, a lot of the reasons individuals say, well, I'm not a Christian because they're hypocritical, they're judgmental, they perceive that Christians inside the church aren't living a life differently, and it isn't attractive to the non-Christian world. So how can we be faithful?
Well, and I think just to acknowledge that the caller has a really great point of view, that we have not lived up to this, and it is imperative, it is true to Scripture that we have to acknowledge the places as sinful, broken people where we have failed to represent Jesus well. And the church, we can't fix a broken culture. We can only be faithful as a community of churchgoers and Christ followers. So I think he's right on. And really this idea of 5 ways to be faithful helps to make some of those connections. Essentially, we don't need to go through all 5, but you start with theology. What do we believe about these things? And then the other 4 dimensions are things like our relationships, how churches minister, sort of the political dimension, the commercial dimension, businesses and civic sort of public square. And so, we have to work out our beliefs in these different relational and sort of civic-oriented discussions. Some of our callers, Yvonne and others, have sort of have talked us through those kinds of things. It's the relationships, and then how does that all get worked out? And so, to be people of good faith, this is part of the reason that we worked on this book, was to help people really understand that it's a very complex set of questions. It in fact requires us to think very clearly about these things, to understand what Scripture teaches, to have confidence that Scripture is countercultural and is true to us as humans. And so that was part of our heart behind this book, was really to help people make some connections between these very difficult topics.
Let me, for just a minute, maybe encourage, since we're almost out of time, both of you to talk about what we can find on the website. And since I just heard from David, Gabe, talk for just a minute, because I would think that some of our listeners are familiar with what you do at Cube, at qideas.org. We have some great material there. So what will people find when they land on that website?
We've tried to create a place where they can learn and become more informed and educated on all manner of issues. In fact, tonight, Kerby, we have an event happening in 75 cities around the world where it's called Q Commons at qcommons.com, and people can go to that website and see the one closest to them. And we're having a 2-hour evening with Andy Crouch. David Kinnaman is giving a 9-minute talk tonight. We're having a panel about what does it mean to be good neighbors and engage foster care, adoption, think about refugees and immigration, and so on. So we're trying to engage some of these complex issues. But what I would also want to say to listeners, if you've heard some of what we're talking about and it resonates, or you kind of feel like, man, I want to learn more, one of the things the publisher's doing this first week as the book launches is when you buy the book and go to goodfaithbook.org, we're going to give you the free audio book as well of the book. And so if listeners are like me, that's sometimes an easier way to kind of listen through and get through this, and they like listening to you, Kerby, so they might like listening to this book. We'd love for them to take advantage of that. And we're also encouraging people to not just get a book for yourself. Think about your children. Think about church staff. Think about people where you can actually practice some of these difficult conversations, not just sit and do it in your own head, but actually talk and process out loud. That's what we need in our church lives. I think we need more of that in our communities, and so we're encouraging people to do that.
So again, goodfaithbook.org. We have a link there, but again, you can also get the audio. And just before we run out of time, it's going to have to be fairly short. Most people, Dave Kinnaman, know about Barna.org, but tell them what they would find when they land on that website.
Well, we're trying to do really cutting-edge research to try to keep Christians informed about what's happening. There's stuff on the election, stuff on the research that went into this book, all sorts of information, research articles, stats. If you're doing a Sunday school or sermon, you need some stats for that. All that is available there. And again, we're trying to provide people with an understanding of our times so they can live and respond in a biblical manner by being informed as Christians.
Well, again, just always great to have the two of you on the program. I commend to people the previous book, Unchristian, and this book, Good Faith. And again, you can find it in your local bookstore. You can go to goodfaithbook.org. And certainly I would encourage you to get those resources. So, guys, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby.
Thanks, Kerby. Appreciate it.
And again, that's all we have for today. You can find out more about all the things that we've been talking about in the 2 hours on our website, pointofview.net. Wish we had a little more time. We have a lot more to cover, but we are out of time. So again, I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
From Focus Features in association with Motive Entertainment comes The Young Messiah.
You seek a family from Nazareth with a boy named Jesus.
The Young Messiah imagines the journey of Jesus with his family from Egypt to Nazareth and on to Jerusalem, where his identity is revealed and his destiny fulfilled.
He's just a child.
He is not just a child.
In theaters March 11th. Rated PG-13, may not be appropriate for children under 13. More information at youngmessiahresources.com. Are you concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, and the halls of government? Let me ask, have you invested in things that yield a good harvest? If you're already giving to Point of View each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys